Hello, and today what we're going to be tying is the half and half. The half and half gets its name from basically taking the back half of a Deceiver, Lefty's Deceiver, and the front half of a Clouser Minnow and combining those two together. This is a pattern that really took off in the Chesapeake Bay going after stripers, but honestly, it's worked in the saltwater everywhere, and it works really well in freshwater as well, and for a number of different species. In fact, you can tie these in certain colors and in certain sizes for going after big brook trout, big rainbow trout. Once they get over a certain size, they go pescivorous and go after fish. And it also works really well, especially for largemouth, smallmouth bass. So here in the Virginia region, it's one of those patterns that I think should be of a half dozen patterns that's going to be in your freshwater box and in your saltwater box. And for the upcoming Legends of the Fly tournament in October, it happens every year around October in the Virginia Beach region. This is one of those patterns that I always have on, and if I'm fishing that tournament, I'm going to want to throw. You can have it in a multitude of different colors. The first color that I've got here on the vise, what we're going to tie tonight, is kind of a upgraded, if you will, chartreuse over white, right? And it'll ride in this orientation, hook point up, because it's an inverted fly. But I add a little bit of red accent onto this as well, just to give it a little bit more flair. Don't have to do that. In fact, if you just tie it in all chartreuse or the chartreuse over white, that's going to work just about everywhere. And especially if you're going after sea trout, all chartreuse is probably what you should be throwing first before you try anything else. Throwing a pure white, half and half is another great option, especially at night, early in the morning, late in the evening. This is a great coloration. This also works really well for bass. And you can even go darker, right? So we've got here a black over an olive. Great freshwater pattern. Again, you can try this anywhere and fish it. So, all right, what do we need for materials? Well, the first thing that I like to use, right, is a hook, obviously. And this is going to be a Mustad C52S size 1/0 today. Obviously, you can tie this in many different sizes. And the reality is that you don't need this specific hook. I prefer this hook because it has a slightly longer hook shank to, let's say, a B10S from Gamakatsu, which, by the way, another great hook for this pattern. I just happen to like the orientation of this. And more specifically, I use this hook for some other patterns. And for those patterns, this is a much more specific hook shape for it. The reality is that oftentimes we don't need to use a specific hook for a pattern as long as we have it in the general profile shape. So rather than carrying 20 or 30 different exact hooks for individual patterns, I try to find just a handful of hooks that meet pretty much everything that I tie. So that's the reason why I'm using this particular one in your box, in your tying kit, as long as you've got kind of like a good wide-gapped hook. If you're fishing in saltwater, something that'll hold up to the saltwater environment. Doesn't necessarily need to be stainless steel, but make sure it's a little bit thicker gauge. That'll work really well as well. For the eyes, we're going to be using a lead dumbbell eye. Now, in general, I don't like to use lead eyes. I try to use something else like brass or something. But lead it's denser and it's heavier than most of the substitutes that we have, with the exception of tungsten, and tungsten is very expensive. And you really do need a heavy lead eye to help invert this fly, to help this fly ride hook point up. If it's too light up here in the eye, it may not turn the fly over correctly. So that's why I use lead eyes on this particular pattern. Then for the tail, I like to use strung rooster saddle hackle, right? But really any hackle will work as long as it's relatively long. This is meant to be a longer profile, but it also depends on the size that you're tying. Of course, you can use many different colors. I'm using white today, but pick whatever color you want for the pattern that you're tying. For our thread, I'm going to use a UTC 140 in red. Now this is a thinner thread than probably what you would want to use, especially if you're just learning. And especially if you're just learning how to put on dumbbell eyes, you can go up to a 210 or, you know, I think they call it like a G thread or something in the other sizes, but basically a thicker thread to make it a lot stronger. That is, the reason why I use 140 is I get a cleaner head in the front. Really allows me to build the thread base up evenly, but that's my preference. Certainly you can choose a thicker thread if that will make you more comfortable. For our flash today, I'm going to be using, because I'm doing a red accent, a red saltwater flash. This is a saltwater Flashaboo, but really again, any flash that you have and any color that you would like. I happen to like this because it's a little bit thicker than normal. It holds up a little bit better, especially with the more aggressive saltwater fish that may hit it. I also think that it provides a really nice lateral line on this particular fly. Then for the rest of the fly, we're going to be using Bucktail. And so I'm going to be using 3 different colors today. I've got a white, I've got a chartreuse, and I have a red. Again, you know, use whatever colors you have, whatever colors you think will look good, that'll give you confidence fishing it where you're going to fish it. And then the last 2 things are totally optional. You don't have to use them, but I happen to like to. So I love using a gel type super glue on my dumbbell eyes. You'll see specifically where I'll use this here in a little bit. And I think this really helps those dumbbell eyes to set and to not move later on. And then to make the fly more durable, just some type of, you know, clear head cement, right? I'm using a hard head clear here, but, you know, really you can use, you know, Sally Hansen's, hard as nails, really anything that you want for. Okay, so let's go ahead and get down to it and tie our fly. For those of you who are a bit more advanced, what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to tie this fly kind of in fast forward, much faster than what I can normally tie, but that way you can see the steps. Don't worry, for those of you who are still a beginner or really want to see certain steps of these flies more laid out, we're going to be doing that as well. We'll go through more methodically step by step. So, okay, well, here we go. You know, enjoy this next bit with the fly going very fast. Yeah, so now we're going to go through, now that you've seen everything very quickly, we're going to go through and tie this fly in step by step and explain things in a bit more detail. So obviously the first thing we do is we mount our hook. I like to make sure if it sings on the vise, then I know that I've got it in tight enough. I've also always debarred my hook beforehand, before I start tying, and I always use debarred pliers to do so that I don't risk damaging my vise. I also use debarred pliers for other things as well, so it's a very good multi-use tool on my desk. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start laying down our thread base. Now, rather than laying the thread all the way back and bring it back forward, we're going to save a little bit of thread, a little bit of time, by only coming back maybe halfway at most, and then coming back forward. And the point that we want to come forward to, because on a Clouser, remember this front half of this fly is a Clouser minnow, we tie in the dumbbell eyes about 1/3 of the way down the hook shank. So the hook shank extends from behind the hook eye all the way down to the end of where the hook shank is flat, begins to curve. That's usually right near wherever that barb was. So on this particular hook, we draw this kind of line. This is at the end. And so if we imagine dividing this in thirds, I kind of want my dumbbell eyes to sit right here. If you notice, my thread is just in front of that point. And that's because we're going to lay in what we call kind of a bump or a thread dam. And this is something that we're going to be able to lock our dumbbell eyes against. Doesn't need to be huge, just a little bit to really help keep those eyes in position. And then I'm going to use my secret weapon, a little drop of super glue right at that tie-in point. The other thing that I do is, rather than lay the dumbbell eyes directly down on the hook, I'm going to go ahead and wrap my thread around the dumbbell eye first and then pull everything down onto the hook shank. This helps immediately start to lock the eyes in position, and it gives me some thread wraps for that super glue to start setting against. Now we're using gel super glue, so we have lots of time to work with before it sets. So what we're going to do is put a series of diagonal wraps in the same direction. We're going to do about 10 of them. That's about 10. And we're going to end up with eyes that are really askew, very, very cockeyed. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. Because now what we're going to do is we're going to come in from the opposite direction. So before we went kind of over the front towards the back, now we're coming from the back going towards the front. As we lay in these wraps in this direction, I'm going to put tension on the eyes and twist them back to where they should be. So 3, 4. And you want to do this under tension. Now obviously if you're using thinner thread like me, you can't put a ton of tension. If you're using thicker thread, you can really crank down. It's one of the advantages of thicker thread here. So what that ends up doing, if we put in about the same amount of wraps in each diagonal direction, we're going to get eyes that are pretty much perfectly straight. And then what we'll do is we'll come in underneath to lock in everything. Do this about 10 times again. And there we go. That's it. That's all we need to do for our dumbbell eyes. That super glue is really going to set in with all those threads, really lock it into place. And the way that we tied it in, these really aren't going to move. And so we're not going to have to worry about those eyes shifting on us in the future. So now we can go ahead and continue our thread base back towards the bend of the hook, towards where we're going to have the tail of the fly. For the tail, we're going to go ahead and use our saddle hackle. Again, I'm using white. And we really can use 2 different orientations. And this is personal preference, right? So if we put these in the same orientation, so when you look at the saddle hackle, one side will be shinier, one side will be duller, one side will have kind of the stem of, you can see that here, the stem of the feather going down it, the other side will be smoother, right? So if you put it the same orientation, kind of stem to stem, you'll end up with something where it'll lay more flat, and that looks like this when you're finished tying. If, however, you do it opposite, so smooth side to smooth side, there's usually a natural curve to the feather. So now our feather is curved in orientation, right? It's kind of splayed out. So that results in a fly that looks like this. Usually when you're fishing it, it's going to be together, but if you stop it, it may kick out. This is really good for like swimming frogs, and some people prefer that action. So personal preference, but for this particular fly, in general, I prefer to tie it where I don't have them opposite direction, where they're the same orientation, and it's going to give me a smoother look. A little bit closer to what a minnow should be, right? A minnow doesn't have a forked tail that kicks out to the side. So once I have that orientation in place, I now need to measure the length that I need. So how long do we go? Well, again, a little bit of personal preference, a little bit of, hey, what size of bait fish are you trying to imitate? 'Cause this is supposed to be some type of minnow, some type of bait fish. Can be a larger fish. You can tie this, for a muskie and tie it very, very large. But in our particular case, I'm going to go for about 2 hook shank lengths. If I can hold my tail together, that's close enough. So we're going to do 1 length, kind of visually mark that, and that's about 2 lengths right there. So that's about what I want to use for my tail. So I'm going to go ahead, hold that in position, and then switch hands, right? So I've measured it, I've got it marked at the distance in my right hand, place it down, and without moving the material, grab with my left hand. So now I can let go with my right, and I still have it in place, still at the right distance. So now what we're going to do is maybe 2 or 3 loose wraps. Notice I'm not really cinching down on this material until I get maybe 2 or 3 wraps in, and then I'm pulling up. We want to pull up, not down. If we pull down, we're going to start twisting the feathers around the hook shank. By pulling up, it's going to stay more in place. And what we're going to do, let's do a little bit of a corkscrew too. We're going to start just wrapping this feather up towards those dumbbell eyes. That's going to really make sure that these are locked into place. So I've got them tied up about where I need them to be. So go ahead, cut off the excess, and put in a couple wraps just to clean it up. Don't need to go too terribly crazy, because I'm going to be going right back over this area here in just a minute with some flash. But now, if you need to do an adjustment, you can, but if you pulled up versus down, remember, up on tension, not down, they should be pretty straight. And so that's the way that you can put this in. And by having that material all the way up that hook shank, this is really going to stay in place. It's not easy to pull out. So, this is really going to be nice and secured. Okay, so the next thing we need is flash. I like to use 2 strands of flash, and I always cut all the way up on the package. I don't like to just cut it to the exact length I need. I know I'm going to have a little bit of excess. That's okay, because it's going to make it so that all of my flash is always the same length, easy for me for whatever I need to tie in the future. So I'm going to try to get, when I go to lay it down, in kind of the right length, which should be just a little bit longer than my tail. And I want to hold it laterally, kind of right against the hook shank. And again, I'm going to put in maybe 1 or 2 or 3 loose wraps. Nothing super tight. Allows me to come back in and adjust as needed. And now I'm going to start putting in tension. Again, on the upstroke, not on the downstroke. And you see how that material is not moving? Now watch this. I'm going to put pressure on the downstroke instead of that upstroke. See how that's starting to spin now underneath that hook? That's because that's what happens when you go on the downstroke versus the up. So really practice that. Okay, so let me explain what I'm doing now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my 2 strands, bring it up and over the hook shank and back towards me, and hold it back at a slight angle. What this does is allow the flash to be moved to the other side without having to cut it, and really helps keep from having a big material bump. This also ensures that this flash is super locked in, right? Because now we've got it tied in, going up and back. Almost no way for a fish to be able to pull this flash out of this fly. So we're going to go ahead and cut it the same length as the other, and that's it. Now our flash is locked into place. So now we can really clean this area up. If we've got any kind of loose feathers, if we've got a little bit of a bump, we can kind of push it down with our fingers, put some material, some thread over it, really help clean and strengthen and smooth out this area. The other thing that we can do, we're going to advance our thread in front of the dumbbell eyes to get ready for the next, is we can put in a little bit of head cement now, if we want. This is totally optional. You don't have to do this. I like to do it. It makes the fly a little bit more durable, especially if you have some fish with some teeth. So just a little bit, not a ton. And I like to put a little bit up here in those threads in that dumbbell eye, just a little bit along the bottom. That helps further lock in those eyes in place. This is going to soak into the thread and really help make this fly a lot stronger, especially since we may be bouncing it along the bottom, sand bottom, especially in saltwater. We have a lot of abrasion that we're going to need to contend with. Okay, so now that we have that in place, let's go ahead and put on our bucktail. Now, because this fly is going to ride hook point up, its orientation right now on the vise is upside down. So we need to remember that. Ultimately, the fly is going to ride like this. So we need to make sure that when we're tying it in, we tie our lighter color, in this case white, on the top normally, but will be the underside, the bottom of the fly. We don't need a ton of material. What I'm looking for is just a pretty small bundle, really something like that, right? I'm going to try to tie this pretty sparsely. It actually will fish better. It'll jig more if it's tied sparsely versus lots and lots of material. Again, that's my preference, but you can play around with it and see how it fishes for you. So I'm going to go ahead and tie it in at an angle, and again pulling on the upstroke, move that material forward. Now, tying at an angle isn't as important for this because we're going to come behind those dumbbell eyes. See, I tied forward, went underneath the eyes. Now I'm going to tie behind those eyes and come back and secure in place with a half dozen or so wraps, and then come back forward. So it should lay in pretty much that type of orientation. But tying it at an angle is more critical when we invert this fly over. Easy for me, I've got a rotary vise. But when we tie the top of the fly, which is on the underside of the hook. And you'll see that here in just a second. So for the next color, I like to use probably twice the amount that I did for the bottom color. So I'm going to do about twice the amount of chartreuse as I did the white. And by the way, if you're not going to get fancy like me and put on that red accent, you can totally get away with just stopping here after we put in the chartreuse and be done. And I'll point that spot out here in just a moment. I do want to cover, just in case you haven't done this before, how to clean up your bucktail. So I've cut out a bundle, and if I go ahead and I hold it about halfway or farther back, I'm going to pull out some shorts, right? So I've got lots of shorts that I just pulled out. I want to do that a couple of times to really help get those smaller fibers, hairs out. So that's really how you kind of clean it up. And so now most of these are similar length. There's a natural taper to it, and you kind of want that. The next thing that I'm doing is measuring it against the length. And I don't want it the same length as my tail. I like to have it about 3/4 of the way back. And that looks pretty good at about that orientation. So I'm going to remember that spot. I've got it marked right now on my right hand. So I'm going to just change the material over to my left and go in, and I'm going to cut it about here. Gives me enough room to actually tie it in place. So I'm not going to move my left hand because I've got that measured out. I've cut off that excess material, and now I'm going to hold it in place, and I'm going to hold it at an angle. Notice I'm not tying it in like this. I'm tying it in at an extreme angle. And if you do that, and we're going to put the first few wraps pretty loose. We're not going to go super tight. Now that we put about 3 or 4 wraps in, we're going to start getting tighter and tighter and tighter. The reason we do that is to keep these hairs from flaring. They still should be a pretty good orientation if we don't put a ton of pressure back towards this spot here. So now if I let it go, we can see 1, it didn't flare, and 2, it naturally wants to have, let me straighten some of these out that got stuck. It naturally kind of wants to ride at this angle, right? So you can see that on some of these others. where this hair sits going up. That gives us a bigger profile from the side while still retaining a relatively thin profile in this direction. And that comes from the Clouser Minnow. And that's a great way of imitating bulk without actually having to tie with lots and lots of material. Okay, so the last thing that we want to do is put in our fun red accent. And that's just with a little bit of red bucktail. And we don't need a ton here, just a relatively small amount. We'll do it just enough to, you know, either just add an accent color, maybe make it look wounded. I don't know. I just tend to think it fishes better, probably because I have more confidence in it. And whatever fly you have more confidence in personally, you're going to fish it a little bit longer, a little bit harder, put a little bit more effort into it usually, and you're going to do it subconscious. And that's going to result in you having a greater chance of catching fish. So this just works for me. All right, so I've got just a small amount, and rather than having it back the same 3/4 length, I'm going to put it back maybe about 3/4 of the length of the chartreuse, right? So I think overall, what, 3/4 and 3/4, about halfway back on our main tail. So once I have that position marked, I'm going to kind of come in with my left hand, and I know that I'm going to cut it right at about that point there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut that. Bring that down again at an angle. Same thing. Relatively light, pulling on the upstroke with more tension as I go towards that hook eye. Then I can kind of come back and clean everything up. So I like to kind of hold all these hairs together, stabilize everything. I'm actually not putting a ton of tension in right now. I'm just putting in enough to get a nice taper. This is just aesthetics, to be honest. And a little bit of abrasion resistance, but we're going to help that with some head cement too. So now that I've got that nice taper in place, I'm going to go ahead, do a whip finish. We have a tutorial on this, but let us know in the comments if you want us to do a new tutorial on how to do a whip finish, and we can go through it. I always pull tight after putting in my whip finish, just to make sure all those threads are locked into place, and then cut off the excess. And so as promised, we're going to make this fly a bit more durable. Before we do that, however, we're going to go ahead and put in some more accent. And I like to do that with a black Sharpie marker. Totally optional again, but I just think it makes the fly look that much better. I'm going to turn the fly so that I can see what I'm doing, because this is something where I do need to be able to see. And I'm just going to put in a series of vertical black lines. I'm kind of hold all of the top bucktail. I'm not doing it on the white, just on the chartreuse and the red. Trying not to do it on that feather. Just put in a series of vertical lines, and I want to do that on both sides at the same point. So by holding all the bucktail together, it makes it a little bit easier to accomplish this. So do the same thing again. Come in from multiple angles. Try to get those fibers covered all the way around, and you get that cool kind of accent. And I really think that adds to the fly. Makes it, I think, look a lot nicer in the water. Again, just my preference. So last thing, a little bit of head cement. And we're going to put this on the head of the fly, just up here on our thread wraps, just a small amount, not a ton. Just enough. I had a big drop forming, so I didn't want that to go on. And then I like to put some on what's going to be the underside on those fibers, because sand and rock and wherever you're fishing this close to the bottom, because this may fish very close to the bottom for you, depending on how you fish it, that causes a lot of abrasion. So by letting that head cement soak in there, that's really going to make this fly that much more durable. And that's all there is to it. That is the half and half. Great pattern. One of a half dozen patterns that's in all of my predator fly boxes. I have them in my musky box, my smallmouth box, my largemouth box, my saltwater box for sure, and usually in 1 or 2 different sizes and in several different colors. So if you don't have this, I say give it a try, give it a go, see how you like it, and you know, as always, good luck and tight lines.